Hello, and welcome to episode number 116 of the Point of Convergence podcast. As always, I am your host, ExoAcademian. For those who have been working doggedly to see the matter of the UFO phenomenon grounded in the awareness of the general public, the focus has long been on political engagement. That is to say, the aim has been to have the government disclose what it knows about these mysterious flying objects and the occupants who pilot them. Beyond the exposing of the details of the secrets themselves, the sense has been that only an official announcement from a podium will be sufficient to move this topic solidly into civilization-wide acceptance. That said, what has paradoxically worked in opposition to that goal has been the nature of the data themselves. Said more plainly, the issue often comes down to the high strangeness that comes part and parcel with people's interactions with the anomalous phenomena. Simply put, these inconvenient details stretch credulity, and thus work against the hope of seeing official acknowledgement followed by societal engagement. Here, though, we should offer a clarifying qualifier. These elements of high strangeness, often bordering on apparent absurdity, only stretch credulity in Western circles. In other contemporaneous societies, as well as in shamanic and indigenous societies of the past, these elements aren't at all objectionable. They are, in fact, welcomed within a much more multidimensional model of relational reality. Even as some disclosure advocates work to sanitize some of the data so that the overarching phenomena have a better chance of seeing official acknowledgement and engagement, people within Western society continue to experience the phenomena themselves in all their inconvenient, paradigm-shattering, discombobulating glory. And this is resulting in what one might call a revolution of sorts, but one bubbling up from below rather than descending from on high. This, of course, includes not just highly strange UFOs, but every experiential element that refuses to play by the rules of reductionistic materialism. Here I'm also speaking of elements such as synchronicities, altered states, psi phenomena, etc. Because these elements are being both experienced and documented, they are playing a transformative grassroots role in steering Western perspectives along more shamanic lines, even without acknowledgement from the ivory towers of our civilization. What some particularly astute observers have asked is this perhaps by design? Is this an end goal of the enterprise itself? To drop breadcrumbs along the way so that a wayward civilization is able to find its way back into a more balanced understanding of its place within the interactive whole? This is a compelling argument, one deserving of a closer examination of just what's involved. And that's precisely what we'll endeavor to do in this, the 116th episode of the Point of Convergence podcast. As we begin this week's episode, I'd just like to remind everyone that if you would like to support this podcast and my work in general, and in so doing gain access to all of my content, which includes not just Point of Convergence, Liminal Frames, and Event Horizon, but also the various feature series I create, such as on the Seth material, the Raw Contact material, and the Dolores Cannon material, as well as early access and discounts to my online courses and in-person retreats, you can do so by going to patreon.com/ExoAcademian or by subscribing on Spotify. All right, with that preamble aside, let's jump into this week's episode. This week's episode is titled A Hall of Mirrors Revisited, the Role of the Anomalous in the Shamanizing of the West. In this episode, we're going to be exploring how anomalous experiences, namely UFO and NHI encounters, synchronicities, altered states, psi phenomena, etc., are playing a transformative grassroots role in steering Western perspectives along more shamanic lines. And the question that arises here is this incidental or by design? Perhaps not surprising to you, I'm going to lean towards the latter. By the way, for those of you who are interested in more delving into shamanic overlaps with the UFO phenomenon and other kinds of anomalous experiences, you can look at my episode 96, which is titled Ancient and Modern Contact, which also delves into these matters. So before we break this down and start comparing modern perspectives with more indigenous or shamanic perspectives, let's consider for a moment why this may be happening. What is the end goal? How exactly might this work? Now, some of you may remember a two-part conversation I had with Bernardo Kastrup. And in that conversation, we talked about AI and how AI can learn when it's stuck in a bottleneck, how it can escape that bottleneck. Basically, when an AI system, particularly one trained via optimization algorithms like gradient descent, yes, I know that's kind of techno speak there, when it gets stuck in local minima, it means the system has settled on a suboptimal solution that isn't the best possible answer for the global minimum. This happens because the learning algorithm cannot see past the nearby slope or valley to find a better path forward. Now, again, that sounds kind of like technobabble there, but the point here is that our civilization, Western civilization namely, is stuck in just such a bottleneck, I would suggest, and I know Bernardo basically has the same perspective, that because our Western model has seen a lot of success in terms of our ability to technologically transform our civilization, we've assumed it's a sufficient model to describe all of reality. And in fact, we've rather aggressively ignored, suppressed, and even tried to explain away any phenomena that don't fit within that model. But as I pointed to in the introduction there, people continue to have these anomalous experiences, suggesting not only that this is part of reality, despite what Western models would like to say, but furthermore, that the ongoing engagement with the phenomena is going to require a reckoning of sorts at some point. And the point I'm also making is that this reckoning might be happening in a grassroots kind of way, from the ground up, if you will. So rather than government and academia, circles like that, telling us that actually reality is more complex than we thought and perhaps more relational than we were told, instead, people are having that experience en masse, and this is slowly bubbling up, and eventually, this is how civilization changes. Often, this is how it works. It doesn't come from on high and then drip down. Instead, it happens experientially and eventually has to be acknowledged and engaged with from the ivory towers, if you will. Now, in the introduction, I mentioned that it's high strangeness that is particularly confounding to people who would like to see this acknowledged and grounded and engaged with from political sets and from academia and whatnot. So what am I referring to there? What kinds of elements emerge in these experiences? Well, first of all, as we've discussed many times on this podcast, these experiences are often dream-like, and they are rich in symbolism and thematic tones, and seem to be happening in an alternate realm or state of being or dimension. Now, again, dimension is just a word, a placeholder we've been using recently to describe these kinds of elements. Basically, somehow a human being has some sense that this is not happening on the level of quote-unquote normal reality. And again, this is an invitation into a multidimensional reality, I would suggest. Now, interestingly, I know people who've experienced the UFO phenomenon, people who are abductees/contactees, who are actually hesitant to look at these matters from this perspective, because they too, having grown up in Western society, have come to believe that to acknowledge shamanic elements in these experiences is to make them somehow less real. They will say things like, "I think it's all happening here," because experience has taught them that if they say otherwise, they will be taken less seriously, and even more so, that they will be accused of having made it all up or having mistaken a dream sequence for something quote-unquote real. And here I'm thinking about an example of a friend of mine who back in the 90s worked with John Mack because he was one of these abductees. And one time he was being interviewed by a TV reporter who asked him about the nature of his experience. And when he had the audacity to describe it as seemingly happening in a different dimension, this reporter basically mocked him and said, "There are only 3 dimensions. We know this already. You must be, in other words, making this up, or you're ungrounded in some way." So many of these people experience this over and over again within Western society. And so even some of these contactees/abductees are hesitant sometimes to acknowledge these overlaps with shamanic and indigenous perspectives and experiences described there in alternate states, for instance, because they feel like this will just put it in that category of not real. And they desperately want to be vindicated. They want mainstream society to admit that this really did happen to them. But of course, when we say really, that begs the question, what counts as real? And what indigenous and shamanic perspectives suggest is that this is a much more multidimensional and relational reality than has been acknowledged by Western circles. So that kind of sets the table. This is what's in play here, and we can understand why even people associated with this phenomenon, whether it be researchers trying to get the political set to engage, or even sometimes experiencers themselves, there will sometimes be this tendency to downplay the high strangeness so as to have this finally engaged with by our society. But the point here is that you really cannot do that. As Jacques Vallée has pointed out, this is a feature, not a bug. And in fact, to ignore the high strangeness might be to miss the very point of the entire enterprise. I also want to point out that there are people outside of the UFO phenomenon who have been aware that Western society tends to be too one-dimensional in its understanding of reality, and who have been very critical of Western society's tendency to flatten everything to one surface. Now, Ken Wilber, who has been a big influence on me and who, of course, founded integral theory, has spoken repeatedly about this very tendency. He has said things such as, quote, "Flatland is the belief that only the material, empirical, sensory world is real, that the only truths are objective, third-person, exterior ones. It reduces all interiors, consciousness, values, purpose, and depth to surfaces." He said that in his book, A Theory of Everything. In his book, The Marriage of Sense and Soul, he said, quote, "In Flatland, depth is collapsed into span. All qualitative distinctions are reduced to quantitative ones. Soul is reduced to matter, mind to behavior, spirit to synapse." And in Up from Eden, one of my favorite books from Ken Wilber, he said, quote, "The modern West made a crucial mistake when it collapsed the great chain of being into a great circle of flatland surfaces, a world with no depth, no higher or lower, just lateral sprawl," unquote. All right, so now that we've fully set the table, let's look at some of the differences. Let's begin by looking at the difference between epistemological pluralism and reductionism. So in shamanic or indigenous circles, there's an acceptance of multiple modes of knowing: myth, vision, dream, direct experience, and relationality with nature/spirits. These are valid sources of knowledge. Whereas in Western materialism, there's a privileging of empirical observation and measurement, often excluding subjective or anomalous experiences. Secondly, let's look at the interconnectedness of all beings. In shamanic and indigenous circles, reality is inherently relational. Humans, animals, plants, ancestors, and spirits are all interconnected in this overarching web. Whereas in Western materialism, there tends to be this separation of the observer from the observed, and human consciousness is often seen as separate from, and also we should say superior to, nature. And of course, that gives rise to many of the collective challenges we are facing as a civilization. Let's also think about ontological flexibility. So in shamanic and indigenous circles, there's an allowance for multiple layers of reality. This includes spirit realms, dream time, and this notion of multidimensionality in general, and beings that exist within each of those different frames. Whereas, of course, within Western materialism, there's an assumption of a single objective physical reality, we should stress there, and non-physical entities or dimensions are often dismissed as hallucination or superstition. In other words, as not real. Now, what about this notion of non-human intelligence being taken seriously? Of course, in shamanic and indigenous circles, this is a no-brainer. This is part of their worldview. Non-human intelligences, which include spirits, ancestors, star beings, and animal allies, are real agents with whom humans can communicate and form relationships. It's a two-way dynamic, and furthermore, these different realms can influence each other. In Western materialism, of course, it's quite different. Here we tend to pathologize or ignore such phenomena and or beings, relegating them to the domain of delusion, folklore, or sci-fi. Again, I pointed out before how even this notion of myth, we often think about that within a Western perspective as being not true, as unscientific people just making up stories. Whereas a more helpful perspective is that that is a remnant, remembrance of an interaction with beings in the deep past. Let's talk about purpose, meaning, and participation, because this is a big difference again between Western perspectives and more shamanic and indigenous. In the shamanic and indigenous circles, existence is inherently meaningful. Human beings participate in a larger cosmological drama with purpose and responsibility. Whereas in Western materialism, of course, let's call a spade, life is framed as accidental and purposeless, driven by chance and impersonal forces like natural selection or thermodynamics. And of course, here we come to the postmodern crisis of meaning. One of the real critiques of modernism is that it has produced an understanding of reality that is completely devoid of meaning. So ironically, we're asking people to grow up and become productive members of society, quote unquote, and yet we're asking them to do that with an overarching perspective that suggests this is all accidental, a fluke, and inherently purposeless. So it's difficult to do that for people that inherently desire meaning, because of course we are, at the end of the day, not robots. And I would suggest that this perspective of desiring meaning, of desiring some sort of vision for why we're here, is arising from the sense that, of course, we are part of some interconnected web of life, and that things do happen for meaningful reasons. Later on, we'll talk about synchronicity. Synchronicity is about understanding that the events of our lives that, framed within a Western perspective, seem random and not tied to meaning are actually the very opposite. That the events of our lives on the physical layer are actually the crystallization of the dynamics of the collective unconscious, which is first and foremost a web of meaning. So even things that look random on the surface actually never are. This is something I've talked about before, both in the podcast and in my classes. But it's not just that some events seem synchronistic, but rather that all of life is inherently synchronistic. This, of course, is the same perspective that Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli came to. I'd also like to make the point here that this doesn't suggest that only the warm, glowing, fuzzy experiences are examples of synchronicity. Even tragic ones are also arising as examples of synchronicity. And the point here is that all of the events of our lives, both the ones we label as positive as well as the ones we label as negative, are ultimately arising as catalysts so that we can learn to work with energy, transmute energy. And as I pointed to in the last podcast episode, even when apparently negative events happen in our lives, that can be happening, and I would suggest is happening for the sake of some deeper integration. We need the polarities of light and dark in our life. That is to say, both the positive and negative elements to allow for this deep multidimensional integration. All right, let's move on to the next level of comparison. Here, let's think about the integration of mind, body, and spirit. How do the two different perspectives compare here? Well, in shamanic and indigenous circles, healing and understanding involve addressing all levels of being, including energetic and spiritual imbalances. In Western materialism, of course, there tends to be this fragmenting of treatment and explanation. So psychological issues go to psychologists, physical issues go to doctors, and spiritual issues to religion or are ignored altogether. So a very different perspective in terms of the integrated whole of a being and which elements need to be addressed. In Western materialism, not only do we tend to dole those out to different segments of our society, but the spiritual issues we increasingly ignore altogether as being based on things that aren't even real. And by the way, I'd also like to point out here that what we need are more generalists in our society. When we engage with the UFO phenomenon and all anomalous phenomena, we should be doing so from a generalist perspective. That part of the problem with modern academia is the specialization. This is similar to the problem the U.S. government's run into in terms of the siloing of this phenomenon. So different groups get to look at different elements, but they can't even talk to each other. Well, something very similar happens within mainstream academia. Different specialists engage in different topics, and this prevents the fertile cross-pollination that arises in terms of informing an overarching worldview when you actually can compare notes across different fields of study. So that's something else we need to address. We need to move more towards a shamanic perspective where all of these things are part of a whole rather than discrete pieces that can be studied adequately independently. The next level of comparison is around the issue of time. This has come up repeatedly in this podcast, of course, and the beings often tell us that we don't understand time, that time doesn't even really exist as we conceive of it. And they specifically there are referring more to Western perspectives. So how do shamanic and indigenous circles look at time differently? Well, here the notion is that time can be experienced as cyclical, recursive, or simultaneous across layers of reality. Examples are ancestral time or in dream time. In Western materialism, of course, time is typically seen as linear, mechanistic, and unidirectional. In other words, moving from the past to the present to the future. By the way, though, we should point out here that this is really in referencing conventional thinking. In different fields of study, though, different aspects of academia are recognizing that time does indeed empirically seem to function differently than we've long assumed. So here we have a sense like retrocausality, which is becoming more and more common within physics, for instance. This sense that, yes, in some way the future can determine the present. And that, as we discussed before, what seems to be happening is something like an interference pattern between the past and the future. Even some physicists talking about some apparent strange attractor from the future, almost like an omega point. This again starts to sound a little bit like non-dual teaching. So this is one of the more fascinating aspects of my ongoing engagement with these matters, is that while it began with the UFO phenomenon, what I found is that in other fields of inquiry, for instance, neuroscience, astronomy, and physics, quantum physics specifically, we are seeing this intersection between these different fields where they are pointing to a similar notion of reality, a notion of reality that, interestingly, seems to mirror the shamanic and indigenous worldview more so than it does the traditional Western worldview. All right, our next level of comparison is around story, myth, and symbol as vehicles of truth. In shamanic and indigenous circles, myths and oral traditions are not primitive attempts at science, but actually sophisticated containers of deep truth. In Western materialism, on the other hand, myth is treated as archaic fiction to be replaced irrevocably and utterly by quote-unquote scientific fact. Now, one of the more interesting historical elements that emerged with the modern UFO phenomenon was this sense that these beings would often comment that the things we were doing, the actions we were taking as a modern Western civilization, were impacting domains or realms and levels of beings that we weren't even accounting for. In other words, aspects of reality that we didn't even know exist. So here the sense is that there's more than meets the eye going on, that while we in Western society would like to reduce everything to these surfaces, what we actually have in play is a multidimensional reality that speaks to incredible depth rather than just this sprawl of span, which is what that Ken Wilber quote from earlier drew our attention to. We think here also of how the various beings, the various non-human intelligences will say, we will one day be introduced to this more cosmic family, this cosmic community, when we are ready. But we have to first show that we can be responsible in our actions in terms of how those actions impact this multidimensional cosmic kind of frame of reference. So here we're thinking about comparing shamanic and indigenous perspectives on ethical reciprocity with a more than human world with Western materialistic perspectives. So in shamanic and indigenous circles, ethics are rooted in maintaining balance with the earth and unseen realms. Extraction or violation has metaphysical consequences, in other words. Whereas in Western materialism, ethics are often anthropocentric, and nature is seen as a resource, not a relational partner. Again, we're beginning to see the consequences of when we act that way in the modern world. And again, postmodernism is in many ways a corrective force arising from the excesses of modernism when we began to look at the earth, for instance, only as a commodity. All right, let's move on to the next level of comparison around how these different models of reality think about these anomalous encounters. In shamanic and indigenous circles, accounts of contact with star beings, spirits, or even shapeshifters are naturally integrated into the cosmology and cultural practice for that matter. Whereas in Western materialism, of course, there's this struggle to categorize anomalous experiences altogether, and we often pathologize them or debunk them. In other words, we do not look at their reality as suggesting that our model is insufficient. We rather see them, again, as I pointed out in the beginning, as inconvenient elements that we try to explain away so as to maintain our confidence in the sufficiency of our model, which is, of course, an example of the cat chasing its own tail at the very least. Now, as I pointed out at the outset, this is not just about the UFO phenomenon. That is just the one that is most obviously pressing into our awareness as a Western society. But basically, anything anomalous, that is to say, anything that violates consensus reality or materialistic expectations, is seen as problematic in the mainstream. This includes UFOs and NHI contact, but it also includes near-death experiences, telepathy and precognition and other psi capacities, mystical visions and out-of-body experiences, synchronicities that we mentioned earlier, and/or reality glitches or elements of high strangeness. Each and every one of these are serving as catalysts, initiating a breakdown of Western rational materialist paradigms. And as I pointed out at the outset, many of us see this as deliberate, as a purposeful intervention, if you will, from different levels of reality that we are in relationship with, even if we're not aware of it, to put us on a path that is more harmonious, more in sync with the benefit of the greater good, including the interdimensional greater good. And so that's why I describe these different kinds of experiences as contributing to the shamanizing of the West. And this refers to the revival or emergence of shamanic modes of consciousness. And here we're thinking about direct experience with the sacred or the numinous, healing through altered states and visionary journeys, the resacralizing of nature, psyche, and death. In our society, we have a major taboo around death. We do everything to avoid it, but we also don't want to talk about it. In this more multidimensional perspective, where we are just a soul having a particular temporary experience as a human being within this much larger frame, within the oversoul perspective that I've discussed many times, then death is just seen as a passing through a door. How much healthier would we be individually and collectively if we could look at death in that same manner from a more shamanic kind of perspective? But when it comes to looking at these different kinds of anomalous experiences, we should not just look at the details of the experiences themselves, but also what they produce in the individuals who are experiencing them. Because what we see is an initiation-like crisis that often arises. We also have a decentering of the ego as a result of these experiences, and furthermore, eventually healing and reintegration that arises once this decentering of the ego and the passing through the crisis has happened. Now, in terms of, as I referenced in the beginning, we are seeing a grassroots movement. We're seeing more and more people at the floor of our society, if you will, beginning to pay more attention to these different kinds of perspectives because of what they afford us in terms of a more enchanted view of reality and one that makes better sense of the fullness of our experience. This trend is reflected in growing societal interest in psychedelics, in Jungian depth psychology, in animism and eco-spirituality, and in post-materialist science. So all this is arising because of these experiences, and I think many of us would look at this as a purposeful shift in perspective. And it need not be, I should point out, that some particular intelligence within the whole is acting to make this happen. It may be that there's a rebalancing that naturally arises in the environment, the same way that we see environments in nature naturally respond to grow harmony within the whole. This is built in. This is part of the intelligence of nature itself. But here we're referring to a multidimensional nature rather than just a one-dimensional surface. All right, so as I mentioned at the outset, and I've mentioned a couple times since then, while the UFO phenomenon is not the only kind of anomalous experience that applies here, we do recognize that it has a particular import in our society right now, as we even governmentally wrestle with disclosure and what this all points to. Now, up until now, we focused societally, that is to say congressionally and governmentally, mostly on the craft themselves, although slowly we're beginning to have some engagement around the nature of the beings themselves. We think about how Eric Davis testified to different kinds of beings. That was an interesting moment societally to see that discussed in a congressional meeting of any sort. Of course, beyond that is the question of abduction experiences, where these various non-human intelligences take human beings and subject them to certain kinds of really bizarre and seemingly initiation-like experiences. So let's make a comparison between an indigenous worldview of a kind of contact with a non-human intelligence and aspects of the abduction phenomenon. So let's first think about the spontaneous or crisis onset nature of these experiences. So a shamanic parallel would be where initiation often begins with an uninvited event, such as an illness, accident, near-death experience, or psychological crisis. This is seen as a calling from the spirit world, though, not just as accidental, definitely not just as random. Now, within the abduction experience, of course, we see that these happen suddenly and unexpectedly, often at night or during sleep, creating a traumatic rupture with normal life. So again, there's some parallel there. All right, let's next look at the altered states of consciousness that are apparent in these different kinds of encounters. So the shamanic parallel, of course, is that there's an entry into non-ordinary reality through trance, dreams, fasting, drumming, or plant medicines, and this is done to access spirit realms that are considered real, just as real as this one, just different. In abduction experiences that happen within Western society, again, rather inconveniently, abductees report being in altered states. They are often frozen, paralyzed, or taken out of body altogether. And some describe shifting to a different dimension or space-time distortion. So a lot of parallel here, and these experiences are forcing themselves into our awareness. So even as a collective within Western society, we will begin to reckon with them. What about this notion of being taken to an otherworld realm? The shamanic sense here is, of course, that the shaman is transported to upper, middle, or lower worlds populated by spirits, ancestors, and/or deities. In abduction accounts, the abductee is taken aboard a craft or into an alien dimension that's often sterile, luminous, and strangely symbolic spaces often emerge that defy physics. We think here about how people talk about seeing a craft that's a certain size, going within it and finding it much larger within. So that might be a scientific thing, but it might also be speaking to the fact that reality is more malleable than we think it is, and perhaps even more dreamlike. Now, something else that might be fruitful to compare is the presence of the non-human beings and their roles as guides or sometimes as a kind of persecutor. So in shamanic circles, encounters with animal spirits, gods with a lowercase g there, tricksters, and/or ancestors emerge to test, guide, and empower the initiate. In abduction accounts, gray aliens, insectoids, or tall luminous beings often play the role of observer, examiner, or communicator. Some are benevolent, others seem cold, even clinical. And here again, I'd like to reference my last episode where I talked about multidimensional integration, that even when we are encountering these various others, we are in another way, from a different fractal perspective, actually encountering ourselves, because ultimately we're all refractions of the same one being with many step-down levels within that, like a series of interlocking Chinese boxes. So both are happening here. And again, this can both be a positive and a negative experience, or as we often find with the UFO phenomenon, an experience that begins as discombobulating, overwhelming, and therefore initially seen as negative, but eventually leads to the kind of transformation within the individual who's become an initiate, if you will, just like in shamanic tradition, where the experience is now cherished, that the individual would not trade the experience as overwhelming as it was because of the result, because of the worldview transformation that has resulted in, for instance, no fear of death, no concern about material goods, and a greater care and concern for all sentient life in the cosmos. Let's now look at some of the parallels around physical and energetic interventions. So in shamanic circles, there's something called spiritual surgery. There's also soul retrieval, and energetic transformations are central to initiation, and they may involve symbolic dismemberment or implants. Now, in abduction reports, of course, we hear about surgical procedures, implants, and reproductive experiments, as well as energetic manipulation. All right, let's next consider parallels around ego death and dismemberment. So in shamanic tradition, initiates may experience being torn apart, burned, eaten, or killed in a vision experience. And this symbolizes ego death and transformation that arises as a result, like a phoenix from the flame, if you will. Well, in abduction reports, of course, many report feeling entirely deconstructed or disintegrated during the experience, with total loss of control and identity. And of course, we have even more striking parallels when it comes to actual dismemberment of the apparent physical body. For instance, here we think about the recent report from Lieutenant Colonel John Blitch, who talked about encountering a mantis being that seemed to tear him apart limb by limb before magically putting them all back together. And it was as if this mantis being was saying, "Don't you see, you are so much more than your physical body. We are not ultimately harming you." In other words, this vision of dismemberment happened so as to give rise to a deeper understanding from John Blitch himself. So this can happen, and it feels completely real. It is an experience of dismemberment, but then a reconstitution, and in that experience, this transformation around the sense of who we actually are from a multidimensional perspective. All right, let's now consider reception of knowledge or power in both of these kinds of experiences. So in shamanic tradition, initiates return with healing powers, esoteric knowledge, songs, or visions to guide their community. Now, in abduction reports, of course, some abductees receive downloads, visions of ecological catastrophe, cosmic insight, and or psychic abilities afterwards. So this is very, very common. People come back, and again, not just from encounters with non-human beings, but even after events such as near-death experiences with new psi capacities they did not have before. So often in shamanic tradition, this is seen as a gift being given by these different kinds of beings. Well, similarly here, people will talk about the beings, these people they know from these other realms, these non-human intelligences have gifted them, sometimes augmented their capacities. And again, sometimes in modern circles, we tend to think about these in terms of genetics, modification of genetics, which may be partly what's going on. But I would point out that even there, in terms of these interlocking Chinese boxes, genetics in the physical world is undergirded by these energetic realms. And that's where it's really happening, which is not to say that you would not see the corollary in our genetics as well. All right, let's next look at the sense of returning with a sense of mission or purpose following these encounters. So in shamanic tradition, the shaman returns to serve the tribe, often with a clear role as healer, mediator, or visionary. As I pointed out on previous podcasts, what we sometimes mistake about these experiences from a Western perspective is that this is not just about having a fun experience in an alternate realm. Actually, these shamans would go into these other realms or these other states of consciousness in order to gain actionable intelligence that would direct the actions of the tribe moving forward. In other words, the survival of the tribe sometimes depended on these shamans picking up actionable information in these other realms. And the reason, of course, they can pick up actionable information there is that all of these realms interpenetrate. And some of these beings, though in a kind of shadow biome, do exist in some degree of overlap and can therefore provide information about our physical reality as well, which is just one dimension of a larger reality, of course. In cases of the abduction phenomenon, many abductees feel chosen or tasked with spreading a message, particularly environmental or spiritual warnings are common. So very similar here, not just in terms of the nature of the experiences, but also how these people are changed and what they feel tasked to do as a result. The next parallel we're going to draw is around this sense of being alienated from normal society as a result of these anomalous experiences. So in shamanic tradition, shamans are often considered outsiders. They are sometimes feared as well as being revered, and they are seen as different from ordinary people. Well, as we all know from the many times we've talked about these things on this podcast, abductees often feel socially alienated or disbelieved. And because their worldview has been so radically shifted as a result of these experiences, they experience massive existential dissonance. So major parallel there between the two different circles. Now let's think about time distortion and nonlinear experience. So in shamanic tradition, the initiatory journeys occur outside of linear time, and days may pass in what appear to be minutes or vice versa, depending on the frame, jumping back and forth. Well, in abduction accounts, there's a very similar kind of phenomena, where missing time is a hallmark. Hours vanish, clocks stop, and furthermore, abductees and contactees sometimes have no memory of the events until they're recovered later consciously, and sometimes through hypnosis or dreams. So major relevance there in terms of time distortions, nonlinear experience across both of those traditions. Now let's think about symbolism and archetypal imagery. This brings to mind the last podcast episode. So in shamanic circles, there's a regular use of symbolic animals, tunnels, trees, and cosmic journeys, and there's an overarchingly mythopoetic tone to the entire experience. Well, for abductees/contactees, they often encounter tunnels. They experience light beings. They come across hybrid children and symbolic devices. All of these echo mythic and archetypal themes that we find in shamanism and indigenous circles. Now, speaking of hybrid children, let's next consider hybridization and transformation themes across these two different traditions or models of reality. In shamanic tradition and practice, the initiate may symbolically become part animal or embody a new being, blending human and divine qualities. In abduction reports, many contactees and abductees report being involved in a hybridization program or feeling altered in some way, no longer fully human, as if biologically or spiritually transformed. We think here about the case of Susie Hansen that I discussed in one of my early podcasts, where she on board the craft actually had what she called a dual soul identity. In other words, she felt like she was both human and a gray alien. Although this perspective of this dual quality only emerged when she was on the craft. Very fascinating and massive parallels there with shamanic experience and practice. Let's now think about communication that goes beyond language. In shamanic traditions, spirits often communicate telepathically or symbolically, using songs, images, and a kind of knowing or gnosis that arises without speech. Well, of course, in abduction reports and contact reports in general, telepathic communication with these various NHI is the norm. It's almost universal in abduction and contact accounts, and they often convey complex messages without words. Furthermore, we should go one step further and point out that there's a deep knowing a knowing to the core of the being that arises because the nature of the experience is telepathic. So rather than having to dumb down the experience and use these words as symbols one after another to give a very one-dimensional message, you come into contact with beings and you tap into the fullness of who they are, the fullness of their experience across time and across experience, and they know the same of you. This happens both with contactees and abductees encountering NHI, as well as shamans encountering these various kinds of others in the various realms that they visit. All right, now, of course, this is a recurring theme that happens over time. In other words, both for shamans and for contactees and abductees, there's often this ongoing relationship and this dynamic of interaction that goes on across a lifetime between them and the beings. In shamanism, the relationship with spirits continues throughout the shaman's life, and initiation is just the beginning, not the end. And in abduction reports, many abductees report repeated encounters over months or years, often developing an ongoing relationship with the beings. Now, interestingly, I should point out here that while the hybridization program seems front and center here initially, in other words, even when people are first taken, they are examined medically to make sure they're healthy, and then they are part of this hybridization program where genetic material is taken, reproductive material is taken, so as to give way to these hybrid beings. And then sometimes there is a long gap afterwards where the contactee and abductee no longer hears from the beings. But as is the case with friends of mine that are part of the work that John Mack was involved in the 1990s, while there was a long gap after that period, so basically from the end of the millennium up until more recently, but in light of what's happening in the world as we speak, they are now getting downloads again. They are now being told that some massive moment, some rite of passage is about to happen for humankind, and for that reason, the interaction is being reinstantiated. All for a purpose that's not just individual, but tied to our civilization's integration with this larger multidimensional kind of frame. And on that note, let's consider the role of cosmology and earth care in these perspectives. So in shamanism, shamans act as mediators between human and non-human realms, maintaining balance between earth and cosmos. In abduction reports, many abductees return with visions of Earth destruction or urgent environmental warnings, and they feel enlisted to help preserve planetary balance. So Susie Hansen, who I mentioned earlier, sees herself as being schooled basically and prepared for a role as an ambassador or a mediator between human intelligence and non-human intelligence when this civilization scale rite of passage eventually arises, something that she and many other abductees and contactees understood as happening within their lifetime, hence the reason why they were prepared to begin with. At the outset of our podcast episode today, I also discussed how it is inconvenient for many researchers who are trying to ground this in the mainstream that it does involve so many elements of high strangeness, so many elements that seem, frankly, impossible, at least from a reductionistic materialist perspective. Well, on that note, let's venture into one more level of parallel between shamanic and indigenous perspectives or experiences and what is reported in these contact experiences. So what we're talking about here is when deceased loved ones are encountered during an apparent alien abduction. This certainly adds a deep layer of mystique and spiritual resonance to something that was before considered as a kind of physical encounter between two biological beings. So what is really going on here? So let's consider the overlap in terms of the dead serving as spirit guides or gatekeepers. So in shamanic tradition, deceased loved ones will often be encountered, and they play a role as a guide, a protector, or sometimes even a tester. And their presence marks the passage into the spirit world and signals a liminal crossing, if you will. Well, in abduction reports, abductees sometimes report seeing deceased relatives on board the craft or in luminous realms. And the appearance of these deceased loved ones often lends an element of calm to the experience and helps the individual or the initiate, to use a more shamanic perspective, come into an awareness that this mortal coil, this incarnation, is just one experience of many for a being crossing across this multidimensional kind of frame. So the interpretation here is that these beings may be functioning like psychopomps, helping the abductee to cross into a new level of awareness or reality. Let's next consider the validation of a spiritual realm versus just technological. So in shamanism, the spirit world is real, multivalent, and inhabited by intelligences that can shapeshift or present symbolically. This is, again, reminiscent of what I discussed in the last podcast episode. Well, in abduction reports, when the dead appear, they are sometimes alongside non-human beings, and it suggests the realm being accessed is not just physical or quote-unquote technological, but ontologically complex itself, part psychic, part spiritual, part alien. So the interpretation we come away with is that this supports the view that these experiences are multidimensional, not merely clinical experiments, but encounters within a sacred ontological structure. Next, let's consider reinforcement of initiatory structure. So in shamanic process, the initiate often encounters deceased shamans or ancestors who offer transmissions of knowledge and healing gifts. And in abduction reports, relatives are sometimes involved in reassuring the individual or in the delivery of messages that the experiencer interprets as deeply meaningful, often about life purpose or humanity's future. And of course, sometimes these beings themselves, these apparent aliens, serve as spirit guides in a way, and sometimes remind the individual of a mission they chose before this life even arose. So the interpretation here is that this signals the initiatory legitimacy of these encounters, transforming trauma into a sacred passage. Again, both the positive and the negative, or at least what's initially regarded as positive and negative in terms of experience, can be used in this kind of sacred passage. Now let's consider the blurring of the lines between ancestral and alien. So in a shamanic cosmology, ancestors and otherworldly beings often exist on a spectrum. And spirits can be animals, they can be elementals, they can be stellar, or ancestral. So the categories themselves are fluid, not rigid. And when we think about the abduction motif, some abductees report that the beings themselves say they are connected to us, sometimes claiming themselves to be ancestors to the individual or stewards of humanity altogether. So the takeaway here is that the appearance of the dead alongside ETs suggests a unified cosmology where ancestry, soul migration, and interdimensionality converge. Speak about a point of convergence, there you go. Now let's think about continuity of consciousness after death, because this is very common in both of these different kinds of experiences. So in shamanic teaching, consciousness, of course, survives death. And the shaman verifies this directly in their journeys and what they bring back. And when it comes to abduction evidence, encounters with the dead, especially those conveying knowledge the experiencer could not know otherwise, mirror near-death and psychospiritual encounters. In other words, they validate non-local consciousness and survival after bodily death. Now let's consider another implication of these experiences, which suggest a shared realm between the dead and extraterrestrials or aliens, whatever you want to call them. In the shamanic worldview, these various realms are shared, and animals, ancestors, gods with a small g again, and celestial beings occupy overlapping, intersecting, interpenetrating realms. In abduction accounts, the dead and aliens appear in the same vision or space, and this implies interoperability of realms, where aliens are not just physical beings, though they are also that, but in addition, they are participants in a shared metaphysical ecology. Again, this is so much about the nature of reality, not just the question of alien beings in our midst. And on that note, we've come to the close of another edition of the Point of Convergence podcast. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/ExoAcademian or by subscribing on Spotify. But until next time, friends, from deep within the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, this is ExoAcademian signing out.